Melissa Lish had always been a bright, hopeful young woman filled with dreams of the future. At 30 years old, she was full of life and excitement, especially as she eagerly anticipated the arrival of her first child. Melissa had been pregnant for several months and had already chosen a name for her baby boy Barrett. She was thrilled about becoming a mother, and the joy of bringing a new life into the world filled her with anticipation. Her pregnancy was not a secret, and she spoke openly about her plans for the future, sharing her excitement with close friends and family members. But on December 9th, 2020, everything came crashing down. The fire that consumed her home was the beginning of a nightmare that no one saw coming. The blaze which tore through the house would initially seem like nothing more than an unfortunate tragedy and accident, perhaps caused by an electrical malfunction or a kitchen mishap. But as firefighters responded to the scene and investigators began to piece together the circumstances surrounding the fire, the reality became something much darker. The fire department had arrived quickly, but by the time they reached the home, the damage was already done. The house was consumed by flames, and Melissa was found dead inside. The firefighters worked tirelessly to extinguish the fire, but Melissa's body was already beyond saving. As the smoke cleared, the authorities began their investigation, trying to piece together what had happened. Initially, there were no clear signs of foul play. The fire seemed to have started in the kitchen, and there was no indication of any other cause. Yet, as the weeks went by, the investigation began to take a turn. During the autopsy, something shocking was discovered. Melissa had not died from the fire. The cause of death was not burns or smoke inhalation, but strangulation. She had been murdered long before the fire had even started. This revelation stunned her family, who had been mourning the loss of her life, only to learn that her death was far more sinister than they could have imagined. Melissa's mother, Deanna Lish, was devastated. The shock of losing her daughter was compounded by the horrifying knowledge that Melissa's death had been intentional. As the investigation deepened, it became clear that someone had deliberately taken Melissa's life. She hadn't simply been the victim of an accident or an unforeseen tragedy, she had been murdered. And the evidence suggested that the killer was someone very close to her boyfriend, Matthew Ploy. Matthew had been in a secretive and complicated relationship with Melissa. While Melissa had been excited about the pregnancy, Matthew had been less than thrilled. He wasn't ready to become a father, and had been avoiding the reality of the situation. Melissa had hoped that he would come to terms with their future together and accept the responsibility of raising their child, but Matthew had other plans. He had been involved in other relationships and had been secretly hoping for a way out of his obligations. As the investigation moved forward, Matthew became the prime suspect. His behavior was cold and indifferent, and his actions on the day of the fire raised questions. Despite the tragic circumstances, Matthew seemed detached, offering little emotional reaction to the death of his girlfriend and their unborn child. Investigators began to dig deeper into his life, searching for any signs of motive or hidden truths. They soon uncovered a tangled web of lies, deceit, and a man desperately trying to avoid responsibility for his actions. The case that had started as a tragic accident now looked more like a carefully orchestrated crime, and the family of Melissa Lish was left to face the unimaginable, the loss of a beloved daughter, a sister, and a mother to be murdered in cold blood, with a killer who had been hiding in plain sight. As the investigation into Melissa Lish's death progressed, the authorities began to unravel a series of chilling truths. What had initially appeared to be an accidental fire now seemed like the tragic culmination of a premeditated crime. Forensic evidence, autopsy results, and witness statements painted a disturbing picture, one that pointed squarely at Melissa's boyfriend, Matthew Ploy. The first red flag came during the autopsy. Medical examiners discovered that Melissa had not died from the fire itself. There was no soot or carbon monoxide in her airways, which would have been present if she had perished due to smoke inhalation. Instead, the cause of death was determined to be strangulation. This was not an accidental death, it was murder. The discovery of hemorrhages around her neck, a clear sign of strangulation, sent a ripple of shock through the investigation team. It was an indication that Melissa had fought for her life, struggling against her attacker in her final moments. At this point, the investigators turned their attention to the people closest to her. Naturally, the primary suspect was Matthew Ploy, her boyfriend at the time of her death. What raised suspicion further was the fact that Matthew had been at her home the day of the fire. He had even admitted to being there during interviews with the police, but his demeanor was cold and evasive. He had been the last person known to have seen her alive, and yet his behavior seemed anything but guilty. When investigators questioned him, he showed little emotion, refusing to provide clear answers and seeming more concerned with maintaining his privacy than explaining what happened. His reluctance to speak only made him look more suspicious. In the days following the fire, detectives began to dig deeper into Matthew's life. They discovered that he had been hiding secrets. For months, he had been involved in multiple relationships, juggling different women while pretending to be committed to Melissa. The revelation shocked her family, who had always believed that she and Matthew were in a stable relationship. But the truth was far different. Matthew was a man who was trying to escape responsibility, particularly the responsibility of fatherhood. The idea of becoming a father terrified him, and it became apparent that he had taken drastic measures to avoid that fate. Detectives also uncovered disturbing details about Matthew's actions in the days leading up to the fire. He had called in sick to work on the day of the fire, something that struck investigators as highly suspicious. Why had he been absent from his duties as a firefighter, especially on such an important day? His decision to stay home when his colleagues were out fighting fires raised a red flag. What did he have to hide? As investigators gathered more evidence, they began to believe that Matthew had intentionally set the fire in an effort to destroy any evidence of the crime. By burning down Melissa's home, he hoped to cover up the fact that he had murdered her. The fire was no accident, it was part of his plan to conceal his actions, and as the investigation continued, the evidence began to pile up. Blood samples, DNA tests, and surveillance footage all pointed to Matthew Ploy as the person responsible for Melissa's death. The breakthrough in the case came during an extended police interview with Matthew Ploy. For hours, investigators grilled him about his whereabouts, his relationship with Melissa, and his actions on the day of the fire. The 7-hour interview was intense, with Lieutenant Brian Kerr leading the questioning. What stood out the most during the interview was Matthew's lack of emotional response. He was eerily calm, almost to the point of being detached. He didn't deny being at the house on the day of the fire, but he also didn't provide any clear explanations for his presence there. When asked if he had gone to Melissa's house to kill her, Matthew's response was telling. He never outright denied it. Instead, he phrased his answers in a way that suggested he wasn't entirely innocent. At one point he said, "I had no intentions of hurting Melissa." To an investigator, that was a chilling statement. The implication was that something had gone wrong, and he had indeed hurt her, whether intentionally or not. But his refusal to outright deny any involvement in her death left an uneasy feeling in the room. The investigators could tell that Matthew was hiding something. His lack of a strong defense or any emotional reaction was unlike most suspects they had interviewed. As the hours dragged on, Matthew remained mostly silent, providing only vague answers to direct questions. He didn't seem to feel the need to defend himself, and that silence spoke volumes. Most suspects would become defensive or upset when accused of such a serious crime, but Matthew showed no such response. His calm demeanor left the investigators with more questions than answers. But what made this interview even more unusual was the absence of any outright confession. Matthew didn't admit to killing Melissa, nor did he deny it. He seemed to be playing a game, one that left investigators frustrated. He did, however, make one telling remark when talking about the baby. Melissa's unborn child, whom she had planned to name Barrett, was going to be a big part of their future. When asked about his feelings regarding the pregnancy, Matthew responded in a way that suggested he had no desire to become a father. The implication was clear. Matthew did not want the child to be born, and he was willing to do whatever it took to avoid the responsibility. The interview ended without a confession, but the investigators knew they were closing in on their suspect. They had gathered enough circumstantial evidence to suspect that Matthew was guilty of both the murder of Melissa and the arson that followed. But they needed more, something concrete, something irrefutable. And that's when they decided to take an unconventional step. They enlisted the help of Fire Chief Rob Schultz. The plan was risky, but the hope was that a conversation between Matthew and Chief Schultz could provide the missing piece of the puzzle. They knew Matthew had a relationship with Schultz, and they hoped that some sort of emotional breakthrough could prompt him to admit to the crime. But as investigators continued their efforts to gather more information, the clock was ticking. They needed to build a strong case, and they needed to do it fast. The investigation had reached a turning point. With the mounting evidence pointing directly to Matthew Ploy, the authorities knew they were very close to solving the case. But there was still one crucial piece of the puzzle missing: a confession. They had gathered plenty of circumstantial evidence, including Matthew's strange behavior, his tangled web of lies, and the forensic evidence pointing to his involvement in Melissa's death, but they still needed something undeniable. That's when they decided to use Fire Chief Rob Schultz in an attempt to break through Matthew's cold demeanor. The idea was simple: Matthew cheat Chief Schultz, and the investigators hoped that a conversation between them could trigger something in Matthew: a moment of guilt, a slip-up, or even an unconscious admission. The approach was a gamble, but the police were running out of time. Chief Schultz was a seasoned firefighter who had worked alongside Matthew in the fire department. The two had known each other for years, and Matthew had always respected Schultz. The police hoped that this report could be leveraged to their advantage. The plan was for Schultz to meet with Matthew under the guise of discussing the fire that had tragically claimed Melissa's life. Schultz was asked to speak with Matthew about the details of the fire and to get his opinion on the incident, knowing full well that the fire was no accident. When the meeting took place, it was clear that Matthew was uncomfortable. Despite their years of camaraderie, he seemed distant and evasive. Chief Schultz began by speaking about the emotional toll of losing someone they both cared about. He spoke of how difficult it was to understand what had happened and how much the department had been affected by the tragedy. Matthew, though, remained tight-lipped. His responses were short and guarded, and he seemed to struggle with even the most basic of questions. But what Schultz did next would be crucial. He subtly shifted the conversation, pressing Matthew on the details of the fire itself. He asked about the ignition point, the cause of the blaze, and whether there were any irregularities that he should know about. At first, Matthew seemed to brush off these questions, but then something changed. His eyes flickered with a mixture of fear and guilt, and he seemed to grow increasingly uncomfortable as the questions continued. The unease was palpable, and it was clear that Matthew was beginning to realize that this conversation was not as innocent as he had thought. Finally, the moment that investigators had been waiting for arrived. Chief Schultz, in a calm and non-threatening manner, said, "Matthew, I know you're a good man, but something doesn't add up here. You were there that day. And I know you didn't mean for it to go this far, but I need to know what happened." It was in that moment that Matthew's facade began to crack. He paused for a long time and then, in a quiet, almost inaudible voice, he said, "I didn't want her to die. I didn't want any of this. But I just couldn't do it anymore." Those words were all it took. Matthew's confession, though hesitant and partial, was the break the investigation needed. It was the first time he admitted to anything resembling guilt. Though he did not outright confess to the murder or arson, the investigators now had a lead that could bring them closer to the truth. They immediately took Matthew into custody and began piecing together the details of his confession. He admitted to planning the death of Melissa and explained how he had tried to make it look like an accident. But the fire, he claimed, had gotten out of control. The investigators believed him to be lying about certain aspects of his story, but it didn't matter. The truth was clear: Matthew had killed Melissa, and his plan to cover it up had failed. The trial of Matthew Ploy was one of the most highly publicized events in the small town's history. The community, which had once been captivated by the tragic story of Melissa Lish's untimely death, now watched in horror as the full details of her murder came to light. The prosecution's case was strong, with physical evidence and Matthew's partial confession pointing to his guilt. But despite the overwhelming evidence, Matthew's defense team sought to portray him as someone who had acted out of fear and panic, suggesting that he had never meant to kill Melissa, and that her death had been a tragic accident. The courtroom was filled with tension as both sides presented their arguments. The prosecution showed the jury photos of Melissa's charred remains and presented the medical examiner's findings that she had been strangled before the fire. The defense, on the other hand, argued that Matthew had never intended for anyone to get hurt, and that the fire had been a tragic, unplanned consequence of a relationship gone wrong. Matthew, who had been emotionally distant throughout much of the proceedings, finally took the stand in his own defense. His testimony was a mixture of vague admissions and denials. He maintained that he had been scared and that he had never meant to hurt Melissa, but the jury was not convinced. As the trial continued, the evidence against him grew even stronger. Investigators presented a series of text messages and phone records that revealed Matthew's true feelings about becoming a father. These messages showed that he had been terrified of the responsibility and had even discussed the idea of terminating the pregnancy with others in the days leading up to the fire. The defense team tried to argue that Matthew's actions were driven by stress and confusion, but the prosecution pushed back, arguing that Matthew had deliberately chosen to kill Melissa in order to avoid facing the consequences of his actions. In the end, the jury found Matthew Ploy guilty of first-degree murder and arson. The verdict was a bittersweet moment for Melissa's family, who had spent months enduring the painful process of waiting for justice. While the conviction brought some measure of closure, it could not erase the pain of losing Melissa and the child she had so dearly wanted. Matthew was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In the years following the trial, the town slowly began to heal. The memory of Melissa Lish, a woman who had been full of hope for the future, would never be forgotten. Her death, though tragic, had brought the community together in ways that no one could have anticipated. Her family, though forever scarred by the loss, found solace in the knowledge that justice had been served. And as for Matthew, his life would be defined by the crime he had committed, the life he had stolen from Melissa and her unborn child, and the future he had destroyed with his own hands.